As part of the three components of a good emission reduction target, I brought up this concept of the percent reduction being informed by science. So let's dig a little further into what makes a target science-based. A science-based target aims to reduce emissions in line with what the latest climate science deems is necessary in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. That goal would be limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. For those listeners who may be following this a bit more closely, you might be asking, well, haven't we already surpassed 1.5 degrees C of warming? And yes, actually, the consensus is that we're already in the territory of dangerous levels of warming. But this remains the goal of the Paris Agreement with the hopes that we can bend the curve on temperature rise. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about the science behind this, there's actually another good US Supply Chain Sustainability School webinar. It's called An Introduction to Climate and Carbon. One way to think about what climate scientists deem is necessary to keep emissions under a certain level is to visualize these reductions on a path from today towards the future. So if we come back to this donut analogy, we can measure the number of donuts that are eaten today by the global population. And then we can say, well, in order to stay healthy, doctors say that the global population should reduce the amount of donuts eaten by a certain amount over time towards zero. A science-based target that's formulated for the near term is usually 5 to 10 years out from the year that it's set. So this gives us a good midway point to understand our progress towards a healthier level of consumption of donuts. In the longer term, which climate scientists consider to be around 2050, we will have reduced our donut consumption, but there will still be some level of donut consumption that will happen beyond 2050. So some donuts will still be eaten. But going forward, when we reach this level of what scientists call residual donut consumption, we can offset the amount of donuts by eating an equal amount of broccoli. If we swap out donut consumption with greenhouse gas emission production, we can kind of see what this looks like in the real world. So similarly, global emissions production should reduce over time to a residual level of emissions beyond 2050. After that, these residual emissions are offset by capturing and then storing an equal amount of carbon emissions. This introduces the concept of carbon offsets, which will be required on these longer term timescales when we reach the residual emissions level. Climate scientists and also doctors agree that it'll be hard or impossible to get the global population to eat zero donuts or produce zero emissions. So no matter what you think about broccoli, we're still going to have to eat it, and we're still going to have some form of offsetting tool in the long term. This is a tricky topic. We're going to address it in a bit more detail later in this presentation. But one of the challenges of climate science is that the climate is a global system, so it spans the entire globe. So we need to find a way to translate our understanding of what's needed in terms of global emission reductions down to the level of reductions that need to happen at the industry level or to an individual company scale. This is challenging to do, but thankfully we have the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, which is an organization whose whole mission it is to define these global emission reduction targets and what climate scientists are saying down to the level of individual companies. In practice, if we come back to this donut analogy, SBTI gives guidance to determine how many donuts each person or each industry eats today, and then what's a reasonable reduction path going forward to 2050. As you can imagine, different people eat a different amount of donuts and have a more or less feasible path to reducing that number to something that's healthy. A person that has higher natural metabolism than another person may actually be able to eat more donuts healthily. There may also be a couple of different people who all have a similar natural rate of metabolism who are all eating a different number of donuts right now, but doctors have mapped a path for each of these people to all converge to eat the same amount of donuts that's healthy for this group. In the world of emissions, different industries might have different required or feasible rates of reduction, and different companies within one industry might be starting at different emission levels, kind of this chart in the bottom middle. But all of these need to converge to the same target level of emissions over time. Based on what climate science and SBTI have deemed to be each industry's emission budget, SBTI quantified a general percent reduction plan that's applicable for most companies. So the science-based reduction for most companies is a 4.2% linear annual reduction over time in scope 1 and 2, and a 2.5% linear annual reduction in scope 3. Some high emitting industries, or we can say some people who particularly like to eat donuts and eat a lot of them, have specific individual guidance to transition to lower emissions over time. So this industry specific guidance supplements kind of the general percent reductions that I mentioned. In addition, SBTI outlines specific requirements that companies need to comply with in order to set and achieve their targets. I won't go into the details here, but in general, you're required to formulate your target in a way that's consistent between other companies so that the ambition and progress can be compared. It also allows us to hold companies accountable for the progress that they make on their emission reduction targets. There is an important lesson within what we're talking about, which is that SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, does not equal science-based targets. And what I mean by this is a target can be science-based without being validated by the SBTI, which is like a whole process and you pay. However, SBTI does produce guidance documents that help companies set and validate their targets to ensure they are indeed science-based. So this reveals kind of the value of third-party verification or validation. SBTI now means something in the market. Companies may be asked to have SBTI validated targets because there's a certain amount of value in having an independent third-party sign off on your target. Make sure that it's matching the criteria and making sure that your target is aligned to the best available climate science today. SBTI is not the only organization that's helping companies set emission reduction targets. There are actually a number of different ones in the market right now. The Climate Pledge, Exponential Roadmap, there's forthcoming guidance from ISO, as well as the British Standards Institute, which has a standard on carbon neutrality that is different from net zero, which is what we've been talking about so far. But again, we'll address that on a future slide. But in general, SBTI has risen to the top in terms of adoption and acceptance in the market. I think the latest statistic is 40% of the global market cap has SBTI targets. Now, I want to discuss a little bit about how supply chain data can support target achievement. First, I just want to give an example of, well, let me go back. Of a typical manufacturer's emissions profile. So this is an example of a tier 1 contractor, and the chart on the left shows the company's direct or operational emissions. But when we zoom out to include its supply chain emissions, we can see the operational emissions are often minuscule, 1 to 5% of the total emissions picture. So engagement and collaboration with the supply chain is critical in order for companies to achieve their emission reduction targets. When beginning to address supply chain emissions, the first step that companies often take is to measure their baseline. So if you remember, this slide that we showed outlined these 3 components of an emission reduction target. And a key step here is having a stated baseline against which you can measure your progress. So let's look into how supply chain emissions are baselined and measured. In order to establish the baseline, we need to go back to basics. So we're going to bring back the donuts, but in a slightly different way this time. This time we're going to role play as a donut manufacturer. So the first thing I need to do is take an inventory of my operations. What am I buying to run my business at all of these donut plants? And companies are doing this every year to conduct their baseline inventories. They're looking at all their activities within a year and looking to measure the impact of these activities. In the world of donuts, you could think about the measurement of these different ingredients and the impact of them in terms of calories. So let's say, we know that flour in the donut contributes 8 total calories, whereas the yeast is 1 calorie and the sugar is 7 calories, and so on. So in total, based on what the donut is made of, we can say that the donut's impact or what the donut contains is 26 calories, which I guess in this case, it's a mini donut. I don't know any donut that's 26 calories, but this is a mini. So we then map out the ingredients based on their contribution to the total calories within the donut. So let's say I'm a particular type of donut manufacturer. I'm actually a donut manufacturer that's trying to reduce the calories in my donut to as close to zero as possible. So I know what's contributing the most to my donut's calorie profile. And I'm going to think about how I may be able to reduce the calories per donut. This is the same exercise we would do to measure baseline greenhouse gas emissions. You go through the process. Well, what materials do you buy? What's the environmental impact of each material? And companies who have emission reduction targets use this information to then make decisions about where to begin engaging their suppliers. Usually the most impactful materials and suppliers are addressed first. From my measurement, I know that sugar and flour contribute the most to the mini donut's calories. In fact, 58% of the calories are from just these two ingredients. So we can consider these as our hotspots where we should begin focusing our attention. Let's restate this mini donut manufacturing example into the language of greenhouse gas emissions. We can say that from our inventory work, we know that the majority of emissions come from two raw materials, sugar and enriched wheat flour. So in order to reduce the emissions, we need to engage the suppliers that supply these raw materials. And there are two main goals with this supplier engagement. First, we want to collect primary data on raw material emissions. So for this, we would need to ask the supplier for the actual emissions they've measured, which will allow us to replace the estimates that we've made. It may be standard to report calories per ingredient, but it's not standard right now to report emissions per raw material. So we often need to make estimates, and we want to clean up these estimates to make sure that we're targeting the right hotspots. The second goal with supplier engagement is we want to be able to track raw material emissions over time to ensure that our suppliers are also working to reduce their emissions. And we want to be able to document and report this every year. Having a good handle on where my hotspots for emissions lie, what is the primary emissions data for these raw materials, and how these emissions from these raw materials are changing over time allows companies to track their emission reduction efforts that are happening upstream, even though they don't have direct control over it. This also allows companies to, in theory, prioritize buying from suppliers who are tracking and reducing their impact over time. And we're seeing this happen in the procurement landscape more and more, this kind of prioritized buying or preferred supplier selection based on who is tracking and reducing their impact. So I put on screen a couple of the commonly used methods that companies are using to collect supply chain sustainability data. You may have had direct experience with this. One of the big ones is EcoVadis. This asks suppliers to provide information on a company's ESG efforts and their progress. There's also a similar annual questionnaire, which is CDP. This also asks about company performance on sustainability issues. We've also seen requests for suppliers to have PACT aligned data, PACT data to share with customers. This refers to product level emissions information. Again, these are all just different ways for suppliers to report their baseline emissions so that customers are able to measure and track progress. There's definitely a lot more to say on this topic, but I think if you're interested in future discussions on the role of supply chain data and supply chain data sharing in achieving sustainability objectives, staying up to date on the US Supply Chain Sustainability School website and the webinars is a great way to do that. I want to step back briefly just to talk about this concept of net zero. We've thrown it around a couple times, but what is this and how does it differ from carbon neutral? We've been talking up until now about what it takes for emission reduction targets to be science-based in order to achieve a net zero ambition, but we haven't touched on carbon neutral, so it's worth discussing. Carbon neutral and net zero are very similar terms, but it's important to understand them because there are significant differences. Carbon neutral usually only focuses on one form of greenhouse gas. It's in the name, carbon, whereas net zero typically covers all types of greenhouse gases. We also see that carbon neutral generally focuses on operational neutrality. So that would be like scope 1 and 2, whereas net zero almost always covers scopes 1, 2, and 3. Carbon neutral doesn't actually really have a defined ambition for carbon reduction over time, whereas net zero ambition is usually aligned with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. That's the leading scientific body on climate change. So it's a bit more specific on your path of emission reductions. Carbon neutral also allows for offsetting. So that's part of the reason why there's not a defined ambition for emission reduction, because at any point along this reduction pathway, carbon neutral allows for an equal amount of offsetting. Net zero, on the other hand, does not allow for offsetting, except in the longer term when there are those residual emissions. Think those broccoli, applying the broccoli in later years. I want to zoom in on this last point because it really is the key differentiator between carbon neutral and net zero. So if we come back to this graphic from earlier in the presentation around net zero targets, we brought up this concept of residual donut consumption. This reflects the understanding that it's probably not possible to get donut consumption or emissions reduction or really anything down to zero. There will always be some sort of residual something. So in net zero, beyond a certain time frame, the offsetting of these residual emissions is allowed. Versus for carbon neutral, there is actually an equivalent amount of broccoli being eaten at any of the interim years up to 2050 and beyond. So this gives you the ability to claim carbon neutrality in any year. You can say, my company produces carbon neutral products, or my company's operations were carbon neutral in 2025. Whereas for net zero, the claims you make sound more like, we have set a target to achieve net zero by a certain date, or we're on the path to net zero. So it sounds a little bit different, and the type of communication that's allowed also just creates different reactions in the marketplace. So again, broccoli here is carbon offsetting. The conversation around carbon offsets can be really tricky because it can feel like, by me just eating some additional broccoli, how does that actually have an impact on the fact that I'm still eating some donuts? Taken in the language of carbon emissions, I may be trying to capture some carbon by planting trees or saving a forest from being cut down, but I'm still pumping emissions into the atmosphere. So how does that work? Climate scientists actually agree that there is a role for carbon removals to be used to reach net zero by 2050. Again, this comes back to the concept of zero, goose egg, is a very hard number. It's a very absolute number. And we know that zero is not realistic, right? There will always be some level of residual emissions. So there's an understanding that some amount of carbon removal or carbon offsetting is needed. But the tricky thing is that many of these technologies are novel. So if we wait too long to develop these technologies until 2050, the cost will remain really high. On the other hand, if we start allowing companies to purchase carbon offsets and support the development of these new technologies at the same time, we may be allowing companies to compensate too early. We're not entirely sure how effective all of these carbon technologies might be. So it could be creating a bad situation by disincentivizing actual emission reductions on the path to net zero. I just want to show a little graphic on how carbon offsets work. The concept here is that carbon offsets should be a supplement to your own emission reduction efforts. So you're trying to reduce your own emissions down to some residual level. And then you put money towards some sort of scheme or offset project and you invest in it in order to help someone else reduce their emissions or remove emissions from the atmosphere. So by investing in that project, you basically originated the ability to reduce the amount of emissions that that project would have emitted, and you can claim credit for the amount of reduced emissions. This amount is the same as your residual emissions amount, and so together, your residual emissions and the credits you bought for the avoided or removed emissions are the same, and that's how we reach zero. So that's what we mean by netting out to zero. If you take anything from this discussion away, in case you're zoning out halfway through, the thing to take away would be there's a role for some sort of offset or removal scheme. And there's also a balance to be struck between waiting too long or allowing the use of credits too soon. I think that learning a bit more about kind of the fundamentals of carbon offsetting can also be helpful for better understanding what best practices are there in the market today. And it can also help us know kind of if we're moving in the right direction. So to understand this a little bit better, I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to look at what does good offsetting look like? First, we need to clean up our terminology a little bit. So carbon offsets are what's generated when an activity removes or reduces carbon emissions from the atmosphere. These offsets are then reported and verified, usually by a verification body, and then this verification body issues an associated number of carbon credits. However, not all carbon credits are created equal. Broccoli is not the same as broccoli is not the same as broccoli. One of the things that makes carbon credits different is their origin story, or the type of project that created the offset in the first place. When we think about types of projects, we can categorize these into two broad categories of carbon offsetting projects. We have avoid and reduce and removal projects. The avoid and reduce projects will mostly be familiar. This includes the generation of certain types of renewable energy, nature-based solutions like avoiding deforestation, efficient appliances, cooking stove replacement, that kind of thing, as ways to reduce carbon emissions. On the removal side of things, reforestation might be familiar. So growing more trees captures more carbon from the atmosphere. And then we also have technological carbon capture and storage technologies. Right now, avoid and reduce projects make up about 80% of the market, whereas carbon removal projects are less common, closer to 20%. I want to dig a bit deeper into these removal projects, that 20% kind of lower representation project type, because it's newer and it's also in the middle of a huge level of growth and expansion. I first just want to note that we refer to these as carbon removal projects, but these technologies typically involve both the removal of the carbon from the atmosphere and the durable storage of the emissions that are captured, which is really critical for that long-term decrease in atmospheric emissions, which is what we're aiming for to keep temperatures at a hospitable level. These carbon removal technologies are really interesting. There's kind of a whole world of scientific study these days on capture and removal of carbon, but I want to highlight three examples because I think they sound like they're from a sci-fi film. It's pretty cool what's happening in this world. So the first one is direct air capture. Basically a giant vacuum cleaner. It sucks carbon dioxide right out of the air, and after it catches the carbon, you can then actually bury it underground or use it to sell to soda companies or building material companies who pump that carbon into their products. So direct air capture is a very cool new innovation. The second one is enhanced rock weathering. This is one you may be less familiar with, but the concept here is that you sprinkle these special crushed rocks on the ground or onto a farmer's field. And when rain falls on the rocks, it helps to capture the carbon dioxide from the air, kind of like how a sponge soaks up water. The carbon then travels via the water flow into the ground, basically speeding up the natural rock weathering process, which is the natural carbon cycle of the Earth. And then the third one is microalgae farming. So there are literally companies today that are growing absolutely giant farms of microalgae with the sole intention of harvesting it and burying it in the Sahara Desert. This is a real company. This is a real screenshot from a real farm. And the concept here is that microalgae doesn't need a lot to grow, basically water, nutrients, and sun, and it captures carbon in its growth process. It actually captures a huge amount of carbon per weight of algae. So you're creating these little carbon capture machines, and then you bury them, again, enhancing the Earth's natural carbon cycle. If we think about all of the world's atmospheric greenhouse gases as being contained in a bathtub, we can think about the avoid and reduce projects, that first set of projects, as basically turning down the tap, so putting less emissions into the atmosphere. Whereas in contrast, removal credits are equivalent to basically unplugging the drain and removing the carbon already in the tub. I think this is kind of a helpful, simple way of thinking about these two forms of offset projects. If we look a little bit into offset costs, there's really a wide range here just based on maturity, feasibility, technological readiness. On the lower cost side of the scale, we have things like renewable energy generation, cook stove projects, reforestation programs. These are all just kind of indicative prices, not meant to be anything specific, but I think it's helpful to have a sense of today, what does this carbon offset pricing look like? We can also think of $100 a ton as kind of a helpful benchmark. So the EU today actually has its own compliance-based emission trading scheme where they're selling credits based on their carbon trading system. So in 2023, that price hit $100 a ton for the first time. I think it's a little lower, maybe $70 or $80 a ton today. These credits are not generated from one specific type of project. They're generated actually from industrial manufacturers within Europe. So it's a little bit different, but it's a helpful benchmark for the value that we're placing on the avoidance of carbon these days. And then on the upper end of the scale, carbon offsets can cost well over $1,000 per ton. These are usually the more novel type of technologies. They're expensive for any reason. A new technology is expensive. They're in pilot phase, startup scale. That number is expected to come down over time, but just to give you a range of kind of where things stand today. Back to this concept now, though, of how do we know what makes a good offset project? So the default answer to this is that in order to be robust, the offsetting project needs to have four characteristics. It needs to be real, meaning verifiable, traceable, like I could go into the forest and confirm that, yep, you're growing trees and you're doing what you said you were going to do. It also needs to be additional. So additionality is a really key concept in carbon offsetting, which refers to the fact that without additional financing through the sale of the carbon credits, the project never would have happened. So the project has to only be possible with this additional flow of money from companies who are ultimately going to offtake the offset credits. And this is important because some of the offset projects that I mentioned, like the renewable energy projects, are now reaching a point beyond additionality. In some cases, renewable energy is so cost effective that the developer doesn't need the money from the sale of offset credits to make it work. So many of these renewable energy credits are moot. They're no longer eligible to generate offset credits. Third, the projects need to be measurable. So you actually need to be able to confirm, well, what was the business as usual baseline carbon emission going to be? And against that baseline, you have to demonstrate the avoidance of a certain tonnage of carbon. And then the last characteristic is that it needs to be permanent. The question of permanence is a little interesting in terms of, well, what's the scale of permanence? Are we talking about permanent over a human lifespan, multiple generations, longer? And there are different ways of going about thinking about permanence. And it's really just based on the project type. So in general, this RAMP acronym defines what a robust offsetting project looks like. And these RAMP criteria are confirmed to be true by verifying bodies. These verifying bodies should be independent, transparent, have robust governance. They also serve an important function of making sure there's no double counting, which means they've set up an accurate kind of register of carbon offsetting projects, and they're keeping track of the offsets generated from those projects so that two companies can't make the same claim on the same project. I've listed here some of the most well-known offset verification bodies: Verra, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry. There are a few others as well. And I actually got a question in the last iteration of this presentation about, okay, how do I go out and buy carbon offsets? Let's say I'm convinced, I'm interested. And companies buy carbon offsets through brokers. So there are these kind of intermediate people who work with the verifying bodies and work with the companies to help them purchase and register the offsets that they buy. If you're interested in learning more about that, my contact information is at the end of the deck, so feel free to reach out. When I introduced this slide, I mentioned that this is kind of the default that people go to when they define what a good offset is. But we have to be honest that even good offset projects that have met this robustness criteria and have been verified have been coming under scrutiny. I just snapped a couple of headlines from the last few years. So, there's analysis saying that certain carbon offsets are actually not additional or didn't produce the benefits they said they would. In one case, a large swath of forest burned, and that forest happened to be under protection and generating carbon credits by Microsoft and BP. So carbon offset projects up in smoke, not a headline you want to see about the offsets that you buy, but this is kind of the world of offsetting that we're in. So given this kind of scrutiny and the real problems that exist with offsetting, there is a revitalized movement right now to define what good offsetting practices are. And it's really centered around this concept of high integrity projects. It's a real thing. Federal guidelines had emerged during the Biden administration, as well as the European Union. And there's also a new kind of nonprofit organization called the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. These have all arisen in the last few years around this concept of high integrity carbon offsetting and kind of in response to the scrutiny of the carbon market. There's definitely more to come on this front, though. So summarizing all that, what does all this mean for good offsetting practices today? So offsetting should be secondary to direct reduction, but at the same time, we know climate scientists have agreed that some amount of carbon removal is needed. So it should be secondary, but not exclusive of offsetting. We also know that different project types have unique pros and cons. So if you avoid logging a forest and then it goes up in flames, that's a unique consideration and scenario to consider compared to the risks of getting involved in a super expensive startup scale direct air capture project. Awareness of kind of emerging guidance on this concept and the concept of high integrity credits should hopefully help give companies a bit more guidance when they're making purchasing decisions. But at the end of the day, this is a developing field and this concept of good is still being fully defined. Okay, what's next? We'll go through a brief summary of what we learned and then also what to expect going forward. So one of the biggest takeaways here is these three concepts or these three components of a good emission reduction target, which lead you to the clear actions that need to be taken in order to formulate a target that you can feel good about. So we have these three components. What do these mean for the actions that I should take? The first one is to measure your baseline. This will allow you to know where you're starting from and measure progress over time. The second is to use SBTi's guidance to understand what percent reduction is needed as informed by climate science today. And then lastly, set your target year and begin reducing emissions and track reductions year over year, which will more than likely require engaging your supply chain because you cannot do it alone. And there was actually one more lesson we learned to complement the three components of a good emission reduction target, which is that offsetting can be used as a supplemental action, though not as a replacement for direct reductions. One call that I want to make just before I pass it back to Wendy is that at the time of recording this presentation, SBTi's second round of public consultation for its version 2, its next iteration of their guidance, closed in December. So we're expecting further internal review by SBTi and a finalized version of this new and updated guidance sometime this year. So if you have an active SBTi target and you're wondering how does this affect me, or you're in the process of submitting to SBTi, again, my contact information is on the last slide, and I'll be happy to take any questions after the call. So we learned today about what makes a good emission reduction target, what makes it science-based, how supply chain data can help support target achievement. We also looked at how net zero differs from carbon neutral, and then lastly, what good offsetting looks like. So I just want to say thank you very much. You can find my contact information here, and I hope you all understand why you can call me Natalie Duncan. Thank you. Wendy, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Natalie. Great presentation. I know I make this joke every time, but it always makes me want donuts. We do have a
It's
question.
natural.
Yes. We have a question from James. Is the baseline still valid if you don't have access to the full primary data set and need to estimate part of it? That's a really interesting question, James. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, it's one of the things that holds companies up the most because there's kind of a search for better and better data. There is built into these standards an understanding that companies won't have best watertight 100% data now. And so you're incentivized to begin using estimations and secondary data sets, things like that. So almost, I would say, with certainty, 100% of companies do not have a 100% perfect inventory. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, it shouldn't be used as I don't want to say an excuse, but a reason to not get started. Awesome. Okay. I think we'll wrap it up unless there are any other questions. Do reach out to us. Natalie's been kind enough to provide her contact details here on the slide. It'll also be in the information going out after this session. So if anything does pop into your mind afterwards and you're curious about the topic, please just reach out. Yeah, my thanks again to Natalie for today's presentation. Always wonderful to hear you speak. And I also want to thank all of you for attending today. So thank you very much for your attention and your time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. And if you're watching the Olympics starting tomorrow, yeah, go team. I'm rooting for Canada, but and I hope you guys all have a wonderful weekend. So thanks again, and we'll hope to see you at the next session.
Thanks. Thanks, Wendy.